In July 1964, a New York Times reporter knocked on the door of an ordinary housewife in Queens, New York. She opened it, turned pale, and said 11 words. "My God, I knew this would happen. You've come." The friendly neighbor with the spotless home was the mayor, one of the most feared SS guards of the Nazi camps. And here is the fact almost nobody knows. Roughly 3,700 women served as concentration camp guards. Most were never punished at all. This is what happened to the women of the SS after the camps fell. 5 fates, from the gallows to Queens. The job advertisement. Imagine opening your local newspaper in 1942 and seeing an advertisement between the job listings. Healthy women wanted, ages roughly 21 to 45, no experience required, good wages, better than the factory, free room and board, free uniform, light supervisory work. Most female guards of the Nazi camps were recruited through newspaper classified ads, not from prisons or rallies. Applying alongside housekeepers and secretaries, thousands responded to ordinary job postings for what became a machinery of atrocity. Look at who actually answered. Factory workers tired of 12-hour shifts at the machines, hairdressers, tram conductors, waitresses, farm girls looking for a way off the land, women who did the math and saw that camp supervisor paid nearly double what they were earning, with housing thrown in. For many, it was the best job offer they had ever received in their lives. Ravensbrück, the Reich's only major camp for women, served as a training school for female guards, systematically hardening recruits to stop seeing prisoners as human. About 3,700 women passed through the system, serving across Auschwitz, Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen, and beyond. Ordinary applicants in, something else entirely came out. And then, in the spring of 1945, the whole machine collapsed. The camps fell, the Reich burned, and roughly 3,700 women took off their uniforms and faced the same question at the same moment. What now? What happened to them next splits into 5 fates, 5 roads out of the ashes, and they run from a British gallows to a doorstep in Queens, New York. Open the ledger. Fate 1 begins with a rope. Fate 1, the hanged. The executioner kept a private list his whole career. Every person he ever hanged. His name was Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most famous hangman, and by the end of his life that list held over 400 names. But there was one morning he was asked about for the rest of his days, because on that single morning, he hanged 3 women, one after another, before lunch. The date was December 13th, 1945. The place, Haman Prison, in occupied Germany. And all 3 women on his list that morning had worn the same uniform. The 1945 Belsen trial shocked the world as young, ordinary-looking women stood in the dock alongside male defendants, with survivors recounting their cruelty at Auschwitz and Belsen. It marked the first public reckoning with the fact that the camp's savagery had no gender, a truth humanity still struggles to fully absorb. 3 of those women received the rope. Elisabeth Volkenrath, a hairdresser by trade before the job changed her, who had risen to head the women's compound at Belsen. Juana Bormann, known to prisoners as the woman with the dogs, a tiny figure, barely 40 kilograms, who had used a trained German shepherd as a weapon. And the one whose name became infamous across the world, Irma Gress, 22 years old. So young, so composed in the dock that the press could not look away. At Auschwitz and Belsen, survivors testified she had been among the most feared guards in the entire system. On that December morning, she became the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century. Witnesses recorded her final word, spoken to the hangman himself, as an order: schnell, quickly. Even her own family had recoiled. Years earlier, when her father discovered what work his daughter had taken, accounts tell us he beat her and threw her out of the house. The job advertisement had cost her everything, and she never once said it wasn't worth it. On January 24, 1948, Maria Mondl, chief of the Auschwitz women's camp, was hanged in Krakow. A genuine music lover who founded the camp's famous women's orchestra, she sent thousands to their deaths, while reportedly begging for forgiveness at the end. Gressy, Volkenrath, Bormann, Mandel, a handful of others across Europe. That, almost in its entirety, was Fate 1. And here's the number that should stop you cold. Out of roughly 3,700, the hanged can be counted on your fingers. So what happened to everyone else? Turn the page. Because Fate 2 is a story so strange, so morally impossible, that historians still argue about what it means. The next guard on the ledger was saved from trial by her own prisoners. Fate 2 and 3, the saved and the unrepentant. In December 1946, in the Polish city of Krakow, a woman awaiting trial for crimes against humanity walked out of custody and vanished. Poland hunted her. She was the former chief overseer of Ravensbrück, one of the most senior women in the entire camp system, and her escape should have been a national scandal. But the true scandal, the part that still makes historians put down their pens and stare at the wall, is who hid her. Former prisoners, her own former prisoners. Johanna Langefeld, head guard at Ravensbrück and briefly Auschwitz, quietly protected certain prisoners, especially Polish Catholic women, shielding them from punishments and clashing with SS superiors until the system pushed her out. Though still a guard, some survivors privately marked her as different. After the war, Johanna Langefeld was sheltered by former Ravensbrück prisoners, the very women she had once helped protect, who hid her in Krakow after her December 1946 escape from prison. She worked as a domestic servant, died free in Germany in 1974, and was never tried or sentenced. The Reich's most senior female guard was sheltered from justice by Holocaust survivors because she had shown them fragments of mercy in a place designed to have none. It proves choice existed inside the machine and condemns every claim of "we had no choice" as a lie. Which brings us to Fate 3, the largest and coldest fate of all, the ones who simply walked free. By the early 1950s, the West's appetite for trials was dying. Cold War politics wanted Germany as an ally, not a defendant. Clemency boards emptied the cells, sentences melted away, and the convicted guards came home. Among them, Herta Botha, a guard at Bergen-Belsen, released in December 1951 after serving barely 6 years. She lived quietly for half a century. And then, in 1999, as an old woman, she gave an interview and delivered one of the most chilling answers ever recorded from a perpetrator's mouth. Asked whether she regretted having been a camp guard, whether she had made a mistake, she pushed the question away. A mistake? No, she said. The mistake was that it was a concentration camp, but I had to go, otherwise they would have put me in it. 50 years of freedom, a pension, a peaceful old age, and not 1 gram of remorse. And Herta Both was not the exception among the released. She was the type. But even she is not the strangest entry in this ledger, because one guard's fate involves a vacation romance, an American passport, a spotless house in New York City, and hundreds of neighbors who papered their streets with posters, fighting to save her. Fate 4 answers the doorbell. Fate 4, the housewife of Queens. This fate begins not in Germany, not in a courtroom, but in a restaurant in Tel Aviv, Israel, in 1964. At one table sits a man on vacation, Simon Wiesenthal, the world's most famous Nazi hunter. And during that meal, 3 women approach him. They are survivors of the Majdanek death camp, and they have one request. There was a god, they tell him, the cruelest one, the one prisoners called Kabaiwa, the Mar, for the way she used her iron-studded boots. She was never truly punished. Find her. Wiesenthal wrote down the name, Emaine Braunsteiner. He had no idea that the trail would lead him across 3 countries, 2 decades of lies, and end at a freshly painted house in Queens, New York, where the mother of Majdanek was now baking cakes for her neighbors. Follow the trail as he did, because every step is stranger than the last. It begins in Vienna, with a young woman from a poor, devoutly Catholic family, a girl who dreamed of becoming a nurse but couldn't afford the training, who cleaned houses and worked in R's factory floor. And then, in 1939, came the suggestion that changed everything. And it came, of all people, from her landlord. Guard work at a new women's camp, paid far better than the factory. That was the entire gateway to hell, a rent collector's career tip. She applied. The pay nearly doubled. The camp was Ravensbrück. By 1942, she had been transferred to Majdanek in occupied Poland, and it was there that prisoners gave her the name that would follow her across the Atlantic. Survivors would later testify to the boots, the whip, her role in the selections, including, most unbearably, the tearing of children from their mothers during the roundups for the gas chambers. We will not go further into the details. The testimony exists, and it convicted her. What matters for this fate is what came after, because after the war, justice caught her, and then let her go. An Austrian court in 1948 gave her a sentence of 3 years, and here is the loophole that beggars belief. She was tried only for Ravensbrück. Majdanek, the death camp, the selections, the Mar, never came up, because she simply didn't mention it, and the prosecutors never found it. She served her short term, walked out in 1950, received an amnesty, and started over as a waitress in the Austrian hotels. And then came the romance. An American named Russell Ryan, a construction worker vacationing in Austria, met the tall, blonde waitress and fell completely in love. They married in October 1958 in Canada, and by April 1959, she had entered the United States. On January 19, 1963, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan raised her right hand and became a citizen of the United States of America, the naturalization form asking about her past, and her past politely omitted. The couple settled in Maspeth, Queens, a tidy working-class neighborhood, and here is where the story becomes truly disturbing, because she was, by every neighbor's account, lovely. The house, immaculate. The manor warm and friendly. A woman who chatted over fences and kept fresh paint on the porch. For 5 years, the mayor of Majdanek lived the American dream, until the tip from a Tel Aviv restaurant worked its way through Vienna's network, Vienna, Halifax, Toronto, and finally, an address in Queens. Wiensenel alerted the New York Times. The paper sent a young reporter, Joseph Leveld, to knock on the door. And on that doorstep, in the summer of 1964, came the moment from our opening. The housewife going pale and speaking the 11 words that were a confession in themselves. My God, I knew this would happen. You've come. 19 years of hiding undone by a doorbell. But here's what no one expected. What happened next? The neighborhood did not turn on her. It rallied around her. As the accusations hit the papers, the residents of Maspeth, decent, ordinary Americans, refused to believe that the friendly woman from 72nd Street could be a war criminal. They printed hundreds of posters and pasted them through the neighborhood, campaigning to save her from deportation. And, at the center of the defense, stood her husband. Russell Ryan had known nothing of Ravensbrück, nothing of Majdanek, nothing of the Austrian prison term. And when the truth came out, he made his choice, and he said the sentence that would follow him forever. My wife wouldn't hurt a fly. He believed it. He kept believing it. He spent his savings, hired the lawyers, and stood beside her for every single year of what came next. And what came next took 17 years. First, the Citizenship War. The United States moved to strip her naturalization for lying on her application. She was denaturalized in 1971. Then, West Germany demanded her for trial, and in 1973, history was made. Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan became the first Nazi war criminal ever extradited from the United States of America. The housewife from Queens crossed the Atlantic in custody, back toward the country she had served, and the ghosts she had made. Then came the trial, and it broke every record in German judicial history. The Majdanek trial opened in Dusseldorf on November 26, 1975, with Braunsteiner as the most notorious of the defendants. It ran for 5.5 years, over 350 witnesses, survivors flown in from around the world to point across a courtroom at the guards of their nightmares. The longest and most expensive trial West Germany ever conducted. And through those years of testimony, mothers describing their children taken, women describing the boots, observers noted something about the defendant that became infamous. At times, as the horrors were read into the record, Hermine Braunsteiner sat at the defense table, quietly solving crossword puzzles. On June 30, 1981, the verdict finally came. Guilty for murder and complicity in the deaths at Majdanek. She was the only defendant of the trial to receive a life sentence. The mayor had run for 36 years, across 2 continents, through a marriage, a citizenship, and a white picket fence, and the ledger had found her anyway, almost, because even Fate 4 had one last twist of mercy. She never showed her victims. In 1996, gravely ill, diabetic, a leg amputated, she was released on health grounds. Russell, now elderly, was still there. He had waited through the entire life sentence. She died on April 19, 1999, in Germany, in a care home, in a bed, with a devoted husband, an ending gentler than that of almost any prisoner who ever passed through Majdanek. So weigh Fate 4 honestly, because it refuses to sit still. A landlord's job tip, a death camp, a vacation romance, hundreds of American neighbors with posters, a loyal husband who never stopped believing in a woman who never existed. She was, and this is the unbearable part, genuinely the kind neighbor of Maspeth and genuinely the mayor of Majdanek. Both were true at once, the same hands, And if one guard could hide inside an ordinary life that completely, the question becomes unavoidable. How many never got the knock on the door? That is Fate 5, and its answer is the biggest shock in this entire ledger. Fate 5, the Great Silence, and the last trial in history. On the morning of September 30th, 2021, in a quiet town in northern Germany, a 96-year-old woman slipped out of her nursing home, hailed a taxi, and went on the run from the law. Read that again. A 96-year-old fugitive with a rollator. Police found her hours later at a metro station, trying to disappear, because that morning she was due in court for crimes committed at a Nazi concentration camp 76 years earlier. Her name was Irmgard Forschner, and her story is the final page of this ledger, the fate that answers the question we left hanging. How many never got the knock on the door? Here is the answer, and it is the biggest shock in this entire film. Of the roughly 3,700 women who served as camp guards, the number ever convicted, anywhere on Earth, across all the decades, was only a few dozen. A handful hanged, a few dozen imprisoned, most released within years. And the rest, the overwhelming, crushing majority, thousands of women, were never charged with anything at all. They just went home. Think about what that actually looked like. In the summer of 1945, thousands of women folded away their uniforms, burned their papers, and walked back into ordinary Germany and Austria. They became wives, mothers, grandmothers. They stood in bakery queues, sang in church choirs, knitted sweaters for grandchildren, and told no one. For decade after decade, across dinner tables all over Central Europe, sat kind old women with a locked room in their memory that no one ever thought to open. And why did no one think to open it? This is the most uncomfortable truth in the whole story. Because the world, prosecutors, historians, neighbors, even Nazi hunters, operated for decades on a quiet, unexamined assumption that women couldn't really have been perpetrators. Women were victims of war, or bystanders, or at worst, followers of their men. The investigators hunted commandants and SS officers, men, while the female guards slid through the net of that assumption like water. The very myth that had made these women so useful to the SS, who could suspect them, now made them invisible to justice. Their gender had been their camouflage twice, once in the camps and once for the rest of their lives. Occasionally, the silence cracked, always too late. In Vienna, a woman named Erna Wallisch, a former guard at Modnik, lived peacefully in the same apartment for half a century, while survivor testimony about her sat in files. Prosecutors differed, jurisdictions argued, and in February 2008, she died in her bed, mid-investigation, having never spent a single post-war day in court. Her case became a scandal precisely because everyone understood. She was not the exception. She was the pattern, caught in daylight. And then, when it was almost too late for it to matter at all, the law finally changed its mind. In 2011, a Munich court convicted the camp guard John Demjanjuk on a revolutionary new legal theory. You no longer needed proof of a specific murder by a specific hand. If you had served the machinery of a death camp in any role, you were an accessory to every murder the machine committed while you served it. That single precedent detonated through German law. Suddenly, cold cases 70 years old came alive. Prosecutors began combing nursing homes for the last surviving cogs of the machine, which brings us back to the 96-year-old woman in the taxi, Irmgard Forschner, and never carried a whip. She had been a secretary, a teenage typist, in the commandant's office of the Stutthof concentration camp, taking dictation, typing the orders, processing the paperwork of a camp where tens of thousands died. For 76 years, that had counted as nothing. Under the new law, it counted as everything. Every order she typed was a gear turning in the machine. Her escape attempt bought her a few hours and a set of handcuffs. And then came the detail that makes this case unlike any trial in the history of law. Because Irmgard Forschner had been 18 years old, a teenager, when she sat at that typewriter, German law required that she be tried in juvenile court. Look at that scene. A special courtroom convened in the town of Itzehoe. A defendant of 96 wheeled in wearing sunglasses and a headscarf. Survivors of Stutthof, themselves in their 90s, testifying by video link from around the world, the last witnesses facing the last defendant. And the entire proceeding conducted under the rules written for children. because the accused had been a child of the machine when she served it. On December 20th, 2022, the verdict was read. Guilty. Accessory to murder in 10,505 cases. 10,505 human beings. One count for each life the camp took while her typewriter clattered. The sentence, 2 years, suspended. She would never see a cell. She died in January 2025 at 99. And with her, in all likelihood, Irmgard Furchner was very probably the last person who will ever be convicted for the crimes of the Third Reich. The final verdict in the greatest criminal case in human history. And history, with its strange sense of poetry, chose to pass that final verdict on a woman in a children's court for paperwork. So close the ledger now, and read what it actually says, because the 5 fates, laid side by side, form one of the darkest lessons the 20th century ever taught. Fate 1, a handful hanged, Gress, Mandel, the famous few, enough for the world to feel that justice had been done. Fate 2, Langefeld, saved by her own prisoners, proof that choice existed inside the machine, and that mercy was possible even there, which condemns everyone who chose otherwise. Fate 3, both and the released, free for half a century, remorseless to the last breath. Fate 4, the mayor of Magneck, hidden inside a marriage, a citizenship, and a friendly wave over a queen's fence, defended by posters, loved by a husband, and both halves of her true at once. And Fate 5, the great silence, thousands who were simply never asked. None of these women was born a monster. That is the ledger's unbearable bottom line. They answered job advertisements. They wanted better pay, a uniform, a way up, and the machine took ordinary applicants and returned the mayor, the hyena, the woman with the dogs. Evil, at industrial scale, did not recruit demons. It recruited the classifieds. In the world's refusal to believe that, the comfortable myth that cruelty has a gender, is precisely what let most of them die warm in their beds, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew. So here is the question this ledger leaves open on your table, and it has no comfortable answer. For 50 years after the war, all across Europe, they were simply there. The quiet grandmother at the bakery, the kind old neighbor with the immaculate garden, the sweet great-aunt at Christmas dinner. Thousands of them, carrying it, saying nothing. How many locked rooms sat behind how many friendly faces? And what does it say about all of us that we never thought to knock?